at the University of Washington and with the ENGAGE program. I'm in the Department of Biochemistry, working to reconstruct the protein complexes responsible for making sure that every time a cell divides, both daughter cells get exactly one copy of each chromosome, because it turns out this is a process that goes wrong very often in cancer. You can hear more about that on April 12th. While I'm here, I want to mention that we're here through the Town Hall Seattle program, and the best way to keep up with the Town Hall program is to become a member. Membership offers down front seating, which is more of an advantage in the larger venue at Town Hall. But you also get discounts on book and ticket purchases and a mailed copy of Town Hall's monthly calendar. It also provides the support that is essential for bringing you more than 400 events annually at affordable ticket prices. And now about our third guest. The impact of coal mining on the Appalachian region has led to significant environmental destruction through destructive and consumptive mining techniques and failed management of post-mining landscapes. Mountaintop removal of mining practices have endangered mountainous ecosystems and led to dwindling populations of plants and animals. Our next speaker will expand on the potential for reintroduction of removed plants and animals through group initiatives such as the Forest Reclamation Approach, and presents theories in restoration ecology to restore mining landscapes to their previous natural states. So please give a warm welcome to Ellison Heil, who will, I think, correct my pronunciation of Appalachia at some point.
How are y'all doing tonight?
Great.
Yeah? Everyone all liquicated with some beer and cocktails? I'm not sure if that's a word, but it is now. So hello, my name's Ellison Heil, and I'm from Appalachia, where coal keeps the lights on. Where I grew up, I was indoctrinated very early on into a way of a culture, of a community, of a pathway, of a pastime, many of these terms, that focused around coal. And it was easy to point fingers after going away to college and studying environmental science at the carbon emissions that this pastime and process was creating, especially as we start adjusting with our ramifications of climate change. But we began to realize that, this is what's put food on the table for generations. So we're going to start out the talk by kind of transporting us into Appalachia, and just to get a little tidbit of pronunciation. I've bumped into quite a few people, and just so everyone knows, it's Appalachia, and if you don't say it right, I'm going to throw an apple at you. So that's a good way to remember it. And so an idea of where this area is, this is a map, and what this is going to be doing is it's going to be following the major Appalachian mountain range from the south to the north. A lot of people have probably heard of the Appalachian Trail that runs along through these mountains. So that's the prominent area, and it will run a little bit east and west of that trail. And then specifically, we're going to be focusing in coal country, or the coal fields of central Appalachia. And this is going to comprise parts of West Virginia, Kentucky, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and even stretching up into Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Maryland. So when I say coal mining, everyone usually thinks of, down and dirty, going underground, coming up with black soot on your face. People got fun little headlamps on. Maybe even think back to the Zoolander movie, him running around with his spiffy, and he's like, I think I got the black lung, Pop. But, it's, we have some great documentary of photography and artwork. Here's Norman Cornish does this great painting of two people hunkered down on their way to work with a giant coal pile in the back and railroads, which definitely strikes home to me, coming from a community that wasn't necessarily a coal mining community, but was a railroad community that transported all the coal from the coal country out to our major metropolis cities such as DC, Philadelphia, New York City, even down into Atlanta. So what we want to start doing is we want to transition away from what we commonly think of as coal mining, because it's no longer us sitting down in the deep, dark depths, such as this kid sitting in front of an elevator waiting for the workers to come down so he can open the shaft. We've begun transitioning towards something new with the advent of mechanized machinery and large-scale operations. And we no longer send people down into the coal seams, and where it's less cave-oriented. And this is because of technology, but also for human health. We're no longer wanting our family members to have black lung or cardiac or respiratory issues. So why send them down there when we can use technology to replace that? So here are all of the different ways in which we can get to coal. You can see it running in these horizontal strips, or they call them seams. And we commonly think of our traditional practices, which are outlined here in this black box, as our shaft mine. Think of that kid sitting down at the bottom in front of the elevator. But in fact, coal mining nowadays, our new is going to be focused on mountaintop removal. And this employs only a few people. No longer are we employing hundreds and sending them down in waves into the mines. We're only employing about 9 people to run the mechanized machinery. And so when we start to wonder why is coal dying, it's partly because of this, along with many other reasons. So to help kind of understand how we get to mining, we're gonna start to use an analogy with a cupcake. Yeah, now I have everyone's attention, right? Okay, so if we think of our mountain as a cupcake, we have our fluffy, moist center, and that's going to be this kind of like cake here in the center. And then atop that is going to be this nice brown frosting. And that's going to be our topsoil that accumulates over many, many years. It's not something that gets there quickly. And now what's so important about the topsoil, or the frosting on top, is that if you don't have that frosting on top and you try and put those sprinkles on, our sprinkles, let's think of them as our trees on top of the forest. They're not going to stick. And the same thing is, if you don't have topsoil on top of your mountain, you're not going to be able to have your forest grow back. And so when we're thinking about our mountaintop removal, we're going to be using an analogy which I have adapted from a community called Friends of Coal, which is a major coal-funded community. And they have something called Coal in the Classroom, which in public schools, they hand students these cupcakes, which I'm doing kind of relatively right now, except we're going to adapt this. They focus more on the traditional, the shaft mining, so they hand them straws. And they told them to hunt for chocolate chips scattered throughout the cupcake. Instead, what I want to present to you is an adapted, modified version of this lesson plan. And instead of searching for our little chips or our coal, instead, we're going to be taking massive machinery and we're going to be stripping off that topsoil. And once we have that put away, we're going to rip off the top of the cupcake. And then inside, we're going to be hunting for this little Hershey Kiss. And then, of course, this is what we want because we're an energy-hungry society, right? Think about the kid that just wants the chocolate in the center. That's who we are as United States citizens. Okay. So we're going to maybe go back to this analogy here in a moment. We will go back to this analogy after I clean up my hands. So this is an idea of the scale of what this is happening at. And it's pretty massive. And you might notice this little circle in the center and how they've kind of like, why is there trees sitting right there? This was private property at one point in time. And what you see in the center is actually a family cemetery, which they have left for the family. But of course, you can't have anything else that's around it. So after we remove everything, we load it up with TNT and we explode it. It's pretty awesome, let's be honest. And then afterwards, we were talking about technology. This is some of the technology that they're using. This is called a drag line. This is operated only by one person, but of course could do more shovel loads than I think I could ever do in my entire life. So to start giving you an idea of the scale of how big this is, you can kind of see in the bottom left corner a little tiny yellow truck driving up to this drag line. That truck, here's a zoomed in picture of it receiving a load from a drag line. That truck next to an SUV is about this size. And if that truck was to drop at that, we'll replay. But that's what it would do to that SUV. And let's be honest, we're all thinking about how cool of a transformer we could build with all of this machinery. And we can think about the pyramid that it eats as like the mountain, but that's another analogy for another day. So why is this all possible? And where are we at currently in legislation? So back in '77, we had an act called the Surface Mine Control and Reclamation Act. And this act mandated that after we get to the coal, we can't just leave it barren. We need to get back there and we need to do revegetation, or basically we need to make it green again so that the soil doesn't wash down into the communities downhill. And so we go back in there and we grab a big fire hose full of seeds and fertilizer, think Miracle Grow on your lawn, and we spray it all along the top so that we have some grass grow back on top. And now when this was first passed in '77, it was a great initiative. You know, we're finally getting vegetation back on these mountains. And the communities that were downhill were a little bit less impacted. But what our research is starting to say is that we need to amend this act. We need to bring it up into modern times. It has been a long time since '77. If you think about just technology and how much it has advanced in that time, we know that it's about time that ecology and restoration has also adapted. So we want to talk about succession and present the idea of how forests grow. And if you think about going from left to right over hundreds of years, we start with barren rock. And atop that rock begins to form topsoil. Think of the frosting on top of the cupcake. And once we have that and little grasses, which become shrubs and bushes, and those bushes eventually allow for trees. And eventually we have a forest on the very end after hundreds of years. The problem with our current reclamation practice, when we just put a lot of grasses down that are non-native and just grow really well, is that they stop our bushes and trees from coming into the area and growing. So to give you an idea of what this looks like, here's an example of a mining site which has been reclaimed. It's great, it's green again, but you can see clearly where the mining practices occurred and where they did not occur. You can see the forests which are trying to come back into the area but are stopped because these grasses are so good at growing that they won't let the trees take place. So the next thing we want to think about is if I try and get this cupcake back and I try and put it back together, it's eventually it's going to be this squished mess. And it's no longer that fluffy, moist cupcake or that sponge which allows soil and roots to go through it. It's going to be this dense brick. And the tree roots, think about these thick, dense, woody species. They can no longer send their tendrils down into the ground. And this is also impactful not just for the plants, but also for our water. So if you were to pour water on the brick versus pouring water on the sponge, downstream, it would make a huge impact in what it looks like. And of course, I don't know about you all, but I'd much rather be in the kayak having a little bit of fun. So, to give you an idea of how big this scale is, this is a single mine called the Hobart Mine overlaid Seattle, which you might be a little bit familiar with. I would hope so. I'm not super familiar with it yet, but I'm getting there. So this is an idea of about how big we're looking at. And this is just one of many sites. To give you an idea, we're going to go back to that map which we first showed, and we're going to zoom in into what we call the coal fields of central Appalachia. So we can see Kentucky, West Virginia, parts of Virginia, Tennessee, and North Carolina. And it's a little bit fuzzy to see, especially for those in the back. But to get an idea, the green are supposed to be mountains. They're little triangles which replicate mountains. And then the red is the area of a surface mine. And so the green is an affected mountain, and the red is the surface mining space. So if you think about that red, similar to the one that was overlaid Seattle, it gives you an idea of maybe how big these operations are. And so to get public engaged in this process, beyond those that are just tree huggers like myself, we need to understand that this is also impactful to humans as well. So there was a great community called Appalachian Voices, a nonprofit grassroots organizing community that put together, they called it the human impact of coal. And they overlaid these mountaintop removal sites with various health issues. So the first one we're looking at here is going to be cardiovascular issues. And the more red you see is going to be a higher death rate. And then the green little spots are going to be our mountaintop removal mining sites. And so there's going to be a correlation tied to the mining sites with the cardiovascular diseases. And then this also exists. They did this with lung cancer. I'll give you all a little bit of time to look at these. As well as respiratory diseases. And all cancer. So we begin to understand that this isn't just an environmental issue. This is a human issue as well. And not only are we losing jobs in this area, but we're also having people die, and poverty is shooting through the roof as well. So next I would like to show you Bishop, West Virginia. We can begin showing in the top right of the video, we can see the expansion of a mountaintop removal mine crossing over top of Bishop, which is in the bottom center. And Bishop, West Virginia is about a 50 population town. It's got your classic church, an elementary school, gas station, little convenience store there. And the problem is that they're now downriver from all of this. And there's going to be many pollutants that wash down, not only from, if you think of the brick, everything that's on top, the heavy metals are going to wash into these communities. And there's a stream that runs through. And if we're having recess outside for our children, do we let them play in the stream, or do we have to pull them away? So let's get to the research, to the call to arms. And what exactly are we going to do about this? So we want to reclaim coal country. We want to take it back for the people and reforest this area. So we propose researchers such as mine and many other, and a lot of institutions such as University of Kentucky, West Virginia University, Virginia Tech, propose something called deep ripping, which is basically a giant fork that we take and stab into our cupcake and churn up this and make it kind of like a fluffy mixture again. And so that we have a bit of a sponge again rather than a brick. After that, we're going to go in and we're going to plant native species. We're going to plant trees and shrubs that are native to the area so that we can begin getting forests again. And then lastly, and the most important part, is that we're going to inspire everyone to go dig out that dusty shovel in their shed. And we're going to go into local communities and do outreach. And we're going to involve the community members in this process. And so with that, I'd eventually like to return home and inspire people to go back to these coal mines, to reclaim them as their own, such as that community that had their family cemetery buried up, and bring forests back to these places. And no longer is it going to be kind of a sign of, sadness, but rather resilience and the ability to restore an area. Thank you. Also, questions? Where are you from? I'm from specifically a small town called Salem, but a lot of people would know Roanoke Virginia, along Interstate 81. Back here?
What type of regulations are they putting on the mining facility when it comes to these types of like heavy metals and like probably arsenic would be coming out of the mines? Are there more regulations going into that to prevent runoff going into stream?
So the extent of the regulation is about the act that I showed you, which is the Surface Mine Control and Reclamation Act. And about all that it really says is that you need to make it green again. And about roughly what the mountain originally looked like. So they use this term called approximate original contour, which is a fancy word of try and put the Play-Doh back together to make it look like a mountain, and then put green vegetation on it again. Unfortunately, there's no regulations controlling any sort of pollutants or standardized tests such as stream monitoring, which is going to be the biggest impact most commonly. We're going to switch sides, and then we're going to come back to this side.
That forking that you're talking about, I would suspect that would lift up a lot of those pollutants as well. Is that a danger there?
Yes, so there is a slight issue with kind of increasing the amount of runoff. So the goal is that immediately afterwards, you do it in sections, so you're not going into a whole site and turning it all up at once. You create these things called polygons, and you go in and you do specific sections at a time. And then you try and do it in either the winter or the summer so that there's a little bit less rainfall. And then there's some over here.
Yeah, are these mines operated like on federal public lands via lease, or are they operated on lands that have been purchased by them? Like, is there eventual, is the reason why they have to do this is because it's part of their grant?
Yes, so there's a bit of private land. Eventually it goes into private land, and occasionally they'll lease out public land as well. And they are federally mandated to complete the reclamation process. But unfortunately, they're not very good at setting boundaries for the extent of what their mining site is. So sometimes they'll only even just reclaim half. I think Arjun had one.
So you talked about using native species to reforest these mountains, but potentially if the ground is contaminated or the groundwater is contaminated, native species may have a hard time growing in those soils. Is something that's being explored, potentially other plant species that can grow very well in contaminated soils to maybe even decontaminate the soil?
Yes, this is something I'm actually just recently very interested in and have begun researching is kind of into the world of phytoremediation, or using species that you can think about them as sponges that soak up pollutants. Poplars is a type of tree species poplars and willows are very good at this. And you can actually just cut them off and stick them in the ground. It's probably the easiest planting you'll ever do in your life. And the idea is that you create a big ring around the entire mining site with this, and it would act as kind of like a sponge blanket that would soak up any pollutants so that it wouldn't kind of wash away downhill. And then you do the native species in the center. And then once we have our established forest back holding down all the pollutants, you can go back in and remove those phytoremediated species, which will have kind of taken all the pollutants and put them into their woody biomass. And then you come in and you can actually harvest it as lumber, and then that lumber returns a profit.
Super basic, but you mentioned that coal is always in these little strips. So how does it get that way? Why does it get that way?
So it originally, we're going to go back to Valerie talking about oil. So when Appalachia first rose, Africa smacked into North America, and there was a swamp on the backside, and eventually pieces of, you can say dinosaurs, but also plants and animals, just because it was so swampy, they fell into water and they never fully broke down. And then they kept being piled and piled and piled and eventually pressed and pressed and pressed. And they created these flat horizontal seams from when they were pressed on. And then eventually there'd be soil over top and then swampy conditions again. And that just kept piling up on top of each other. This one over here.
Can you say more about the idea of getting local communities involved in the revegetation effort? Are you not optimistic that there could be a more systemic solution?
So there's a really cool collaborative actually going on right now called to throw some jargon, but it's the Appalachia Regional Reclamation Initiative, and it's a really cool collaborative community group that ties together the coal mines themselves, which is the crazy part. Professors at major institutions, federal, it's like EPA and the Department of Environmental Regulation, and DNR, Department of Natural Resources, and then also volunteers. So the big thing that I'm really interested in is the restoration side of things, and it's may have volunteered it over at Magnuson Park or one of these parks, and it's just a simple opportunity for the tree planting to kind of get them and have the community have a sense that they are having an impact. Is the main reason for the volunteers. But the overarching idea is to have it be a collective community approach. I hope that answered your question.
So you mentioned the federal stuff. Is there anything at the state level that they're doing to?
So the state is hard because it crosses so many borders. So it's mainly a federal issue because a lot of these mining sites will be owned privately and they'll cross both Virginia and West Virginia. So it's more at a federal level than it is at a state level.
Do you have any concerns over that, with that sort of confederation given sort of the federal environment today?
So the question is whether or not we have concerns about the collaboration at a federal level based off our current political state. Yes, very much so. There's a reason why I'm here in Washington presenting, because I have attempted to communicate this to my community, and it's difficult, it's very hard. And some people are receptive, others are very combative, and they see it as you are threatening their livelihoods. So I came here for a little bit, studied, I'm going to try and get my master's and go back with a bit more credibility and a bit more knowledge under my belt and be able to find a new way to kind of present this information to them. So the idea is to maybe wait out the storm and then eventually go back. Because fortunately it can only be 8 years maximum. Hopefully 4 less.
Just a quick question on that. So I guess I'm a bit confused on why there would be backlash. What I'm gathering is you're suggesting land that is not going to be reused for any coal purposes, just to make it better for the community. So what is the backlash that they are, what are you receiving basically?
So this would propose more regulations. And whenever you propose more regulations on the coal communities, they're going to be defensive. It doesn't matter if it, in the end, will help them. It's kind of, they're like a wounded dog right now, and they're defensive. And so if you keep pushing and prodding, they're gonna fight back. They're very vocal and passionate, and they're proud of their heritage. And right now they want it to stay the way it is, and they want it to come back. So it's a very tumultuous, and you have to dance around a lot of subjects. Arjun.
So you mentioned the harvesting of, potentially the phytoremediated trees. Do you see any other opportunities for creating new income sources through this reclamation, like pathway, as a way to maybe make it more attractive to the local community?
Yes, so lumber is usually the biggest one. And within the Surface Mine Act, you're allowed to just return the area to something that's more, it's deemed a better land use than what it was barren. So it could be anything. And if you wanted to, if it's already flat, we could just put a mall up there. That is something that has been proposed, that, or maybe a housing development. But of course, no one really wants to live on top of an old coal mining site. So it's a little bit harder for that. So ultimately, just kind of the ecosystem reclaiming is the big proposal currently.
One question. So would the burden of paying for like the forestry service go to the mining companies, or would that be a taxpayer's issue?
It would have to be on the coal companies.
Go to the coal companies?
is the hopes that because currently they're kind of skirting around the fact that there's like some loopholes. As they're basically doing the bare minimum, and sometimes it's cheaper to pay the fines than it is to do the full reclamation process. So they'll just bite the bullet, pay the fine, and not do the reclamation. So the idea is to make it a more stringent process so that they do have to go in and reclaim. But I think I'm at about time. Everyone's welcome to come talk to me afterwards. Thank you so much.